SADLER'S digital stage presents. In a black and white video, a woman dressed in black kneels on the dance floor of a studio. She shakes her head from side to side, her long hair covering her face. Minutes through the afternoon, she moves her head against the floor. The black hood of her long trench coat covers her head. Louise Lecavalier, Explorations and Improv, February 14 and 16, 2024. She shoots one hand towards the ceiling. She recreates the movement with both hands, stretches one leg, then kneels back up. She removes her hair from her face as she stands up. She frenetically shakes her head and waves her arms close to her face as she turns around. Head bent, she lifts the bottom of her coat over her head. The coat forms a panel stretched over her arms. Her face emerges slightly from the slit in the middle of the fabric. She steps back, then sideways. She steps hesitantly in one spot, then stretches the fabric, revealing her face. She slowly lowers her arms. The fabric of the coat collapses on her shoulders. She shakes her head in quick, sharp movements. She bends one knee, then shifts her weight as she steps back. She widens her legs, then smiles. Louise opens her hands and moves them in small circular motions. She crosses the dance floor and unfolds her long coat, closing it over her head. She walks blindly across the dance floor, her arm outstretched. She energetically crosses the dance floor and removes her hood as she moves her arms. She stops, shakes her hands, and sends one arm backwards. She steps back as she repeats the same movement. She turns around, rolling her fists behind her back. She shoots one arm up, then whips the other one in front of her. She alternately moves them up and down. She spins, opens her arms wide, and tiptoes across the dance floor. She relaxes her arms, then tiptoes in the opposite direction. She shakes her coat, then steps back. She pushes herself against the wall, steps forward, then back to the wall. Kneeling, she slowly gets up. Her coat covers her head, and part of her pale, long, curly hair emerges from the top. She steps back, swaying from side to side. The coat slips from her head. Standing on her coat, she shakes one hand and mechanically steps away from the piece of clothing. She undulates her hips and freely moves her hands and shoulders to the rhythm of the music. She shimmies her hips from side to side and moves her hands in a similar motion. She rotates one arm and raises it to the ceiling. She energetically flails her arms. She repeatedly rolls her arms up and down. She moves them quickly in front of her and inches left and right on the dance floor. She undulates her arms to the side, her knees bent. She shoots her arm forward, then brings them back to the side. Later, she brushes her stomach with her hand. She waves her hand next to her face. Later, she skips backwards, then steps forward on the balls of her feet. Her hand flutters. She covers her mouth, then waves her arms in sharp movements. Dressed in a white shirt and black pants, she crosses and uncrosses her hands experimentally. Her bare feet shift from side to side on the dance floor. She sharply moves her hands, then waves one arm to the side. Her whole body follows the motion in a curve. She slightly bends her knees, brings her feet closer together, then slides them apart. She raises her arms, turns around, and clasps her hands behind her back. She swiftly steps from side to side, unclasps her hands. Later, she moves her arms and legs in synchronicity. She dances rhythmically. She rotates one arm and moves her upper arm with her hip. She stretches her arm, then shakes her knees and runs her hand through her long hair. She crosses and uncrosses her wrists at the level of her hips. She undulates one arm and the opposite leg in a fluid motion, then stops quickly on the dance floor. She brings her arms closer to her torso. She turns around and clasps her hands, stepping side to side. She walks forwards, backwards, and whitens her legs. Later, she wears a white dress shirt. She jumps on one leg and shifts her weight. She kicks her leg up to the side, bending her arms simultaneously. She quickly skips back, then stretches her arms out and skips back again. She stretches her arms out and turns around. She repeats the same sequence. She jumps on one leg and kicks the other one. She jumps on the other leg and alternates. She straightens her body and hops rhythmically while crossing and uncrossing her wrists. She opens and closes her arm to the side and jumps on the spot. She spins to the side and reproduces the same movement, turning across the dance floor. She taps the top of her back foot on the ground. Dressed in black, Louise flutters her hand next to her hip. A hood covers her head. She lowers her gaze. She looks up, then down again. She shakes her hand horizontally and slowly inches forwards. She lifts her flailing arm to the level of her shoulder. She lifts her arm in the air, shaking her hand over her head. She moves her arm around her head, then sharply across her torso. She cuts her hand through the air, sending it up and down, then to the side. She joins both hands, moves them around, then lifts them up and down in a circular motion. She opens her arms, pulls them back, then shimmies her fingers as she steps from side to side. She swings her arms to the sides, rolls her wrists, and steps forward. She steps back as she repeats the same arm movements. She steps forward again, moving her arms sharply across her torso. She releases her arms towards the ground as she steps back. She undulates her body and steps sideways. She tiptoes across the dance floor, lifting her hand to the ceiling. She stumbles back in a diagonal, flailing her hand. She steps across the floor, undulating her arms. She walks back across the floor, slapping one hand and outstretching her arm. She shakes her fists, then jumps backwards twice. She inches forwards, jumps as she undulates her arms. She shoots her arms up and lowers them. She waves them in the air and in front of her torso. She moves her hands swiftly, closes her fists and moves them close to her side. She shakes them close to her knees and alternates them rapidly. She flails her arms. She flexes her arms and alternately brings them to her hips. She folds forwards and shakes her hands. She shakes her head up and down, then points to the side and follows her finger. She extends her arm, steps to the other side, and moves back and forth. She bends her arms and shakes her index fingers, pointing down. She opens her arms and flails them. She curves her arms over her head and undulates them as she tiptoes to the other side of the dance floor. She moves in the other direction and steps back, moving one arm backwards. She curves her arms to the side and fans her claw-like fingers. She daintily steps to the side, then closes her fist behind her back and turns. She messily moves her arms diagonally. She alternately sways her arms up and down, then keeps them up. She shakes her hands, then brings them to her face. She spins, shakes her fists, and moves her hair from her face. She quickly steps across the dance floor. She bends forwards and stands up, then moves in a half circle and repeats the movement. She shakes her hands to the back, then curves one arm over her head. She moves them frantically back and forth. Later, she kicks back one leg, does a few steps, and kicks back the other. She stretches her arms over her head. She jumps twice and skips backwards. She brings one hand to her chest and the other to her stomach. She takes a few steps, then brings her hands to her chest and hops. She repeats the sequence. Steps back and hops. She jumps, arms outstretched. She skips forwards. She takes little jumps to the side, stretching one arm sideways and the other one up. She skips backwards, shaking a hand to the level of her shoulder. Later, she zigzags robotically across the dance floor. She stops in front of the wall, then resumes her zigzagging. She stretches one arm forward and the other one back. She walks along the wall and resumes the choppy zigzagging. She quickly crosses the dance floor. She moves her arms jerkily. She bends her arms up and down as she turns her torso to the sides. She folds forwards and moves her fists, her arms flexed. She deepens her stretch and shakes her head, her hair brushing the floor. She moves halfway up, removing her hair from her face. She bounces her legs. She shakes one hand and takes little steps backwards on the dance floor. Dressed in a black t-shirt and black pants, she moves her hands, her elbows bent inwards. She turns from side to side, then moves her bent arms as she stiffly steps to the side. She undulates her hips. She moves her hips and her bent arms. She wraps her arms around her waist and shakes her hands. She brings her bare feet together. Her body stiffens. Her whole body shakes. She runs a hand through her hair. She hops on the spot and stretches one arm up. She alternately moves her hands back and forth. She crosses and uncrosses her arms, then walks away. She walks back and crosses her arms. Later, she walks in a circle, arms outstretched. She flaps her arms open as she spins around. She slows down, then speeds up the movement. She takes a few steps back, then moves her hands down. She slows down, brushing her hands down. She leans forwards and presses her hands against her legs. The time code of the video appears at the bottom left corner of the image. She slowly stands up. She swings her bent arms downwards and walks across the dance floor. Her movements grow bolder. She takes a few steps across the floor and accelerates her arm movement. On the spot, she intensely moves her bent arms. She bends her knees and folds forward. She looks at the camera, then looks down. She jerks her arms forwards, then stretches her hand to the ground. She stretches her other arm and they both dangle, her fingers brushing the floor. She kneels down and curves her spine. She breathes in, then rests her forehead onto the floor. She moves her hands over the floor in a half circle. On her knees, she rolls up her spine and sways her arms from side to side. She folds forwards and slides one arm on the floor. She stretches one leg back and brings it under her. She clumsily slides onto the floor, her limbs at odd angles. She kneels back up, tilts her head back. She curves her spine, brushes her hand back, and moves her fingers on the floor. On all fours, she crawls forwards. She presses her hips to the floor, then kneels back and frantically taps her hands on the floor. She brushes her knees on the floor, then lifts her head up and down. She rolls back on her knees and crosses her arms on her thighs, head bent. She runs her hand through her hair and crosses her legs, smiling. I should stop. I don't have my knee pads. It's okay. She presses one foot on the floor, then jumps to her feet and stands up. She walks across the dance floor. Minutes through the afternoon. Dance and choreography by Louise Lecavalier, directed in camera by François Blouin. A Fou Glorieux production. Costumes Izzo and Elizabeth Durand. Rehearsal assistant France Bruyère. Commissioned by SADLER'S Digital Stage and Studio. Described video by Mels.